This last speech, the rhetoric, I believe, has flown a bit higher than the facts, and I'd like to take this debate back down to the facts and some of the evidence presented, and ultimately examine whether the facts necessitate either an affirmative ballot, and whether an affirmative ballot will do anything productive, or a negative ballot to stick to status quo. So let's go down the arguments of today's debate, going through the criterion and ultimately the issues of solvency, disadvantages, as well as the inherency points, and examine how the e-waste in the current system is in large part regulated, and how the affirmative plan does nothing to regulate the currently unregulated sectors, and under disadvantages, how they merely, if they regulate anything, simply create economic destruction for these poor communities and for members of the United States recycling areas, which we'll be examining as we go down the disadvantages. So starting off, first of all, I'd like to look at the solvency issues. Now the first point there was that the Environmental Protection Agency is not enforcing e-waste regulation. Now the affirmative speaker came back and responded to this by saying that, well, they're using the not using the Environmental Protection Agency, but rather Customs Enforcement. And I'd like to look at the context of their case. Their first mandate is ban e-waste exports, and they go on explaining how all e-waste exports will be banned except for if a country can deal with the problem. And their second mandate is that the U.S. Customs Enforcement will establish a program to deal with the labeling of this e-waste so that it doesn't get into the countries illicitly. However, the Customs Enforcement is still not in large part responsible for the actions taken to actually decrease the imports of e-waste if they're illegal and if they're banned. If we look at the context of the affirmative case under their agency, they said that enforcement will take place via current means. Currently, we see that the EPA is enforcing e-waste regulation, and the affirmative bans e-waste, and therefore current means necessitate that the EPA, which we've proven to be ineffective in enforcing e-waste regulation, will still be being ineffective in enforcing e-waste regulation. The only evidence to the contrary was of the affirmative case under their second mandate, where they said that the U.S. Customs will establish the labeling program. I'd like to point out the labeling program is not the same as the regulation program, which is handled by the Environmental Protection Agency. So with that, we see that their plan does not provide a viable alternative to the EPA, which we've proven and which was unrefuted, is not effective in hampering the imports or the exports of e-waste. But now let's move to the second solvency. Now that was of the charity loophole. Now they responded to this by saying that that was under the Basel Convention. Most emphatically, it was absolutely not. In fact, the evidence specifically referred to not the Basel Convention, but to voluntary adoptions of stricter regulations on e-waste from the United States and the United Kingdom. Subsequently, we found out that we still needed to export this e-waste, so we found the charity loophole, which is a foreign policy independent from regulations concerning the environment or e-waste, and we say that we can export to these countries using the rationale that it's actually helping them. That's an independent thing, and the article went on to say in depth how the charity loophole cannot be solved in any e-waste regulation, will be ineffective unless the charity loophole is closed down. With that, let's move down to this next solvency point, which is the third one, and they stated that there is a definition. E-waste is any used electronic. Now, Shane offered a good definition. However, I don't think the Supreme Court, or any court for that matter, is going to go to accept his definition, but rather I think we need something a little bit more legally sound in the sense that it's actually passed or contained in a law. We see that the United States doesn't simply pass laws and enforce the gist of those laws. We enforce the laws themselves, and if we ban e-waste, that means e-waste itself will not be exported. The problem is that we don't have a legally enforceable definition of what e-waste is. As we cited, in fact, from the California Bureau of Land Management, that they specifically say in their California's agency for regulating e-waste, and they were talking about some of the problems with national regulation of e-waste, and they state that, quote, there is no clear legally enforceable definition of e-waste. What we see is that the affirmative is banning something, and that there is no enforceable definition of what that something actually is. This links back to solvency, and the affirmative has absolutely no solvency since this is true, because they ban something with no definition of what that something is to regulate it with. With that, let's move on to the next solvency point, or the disadvantages, which is that of the timeline. They said it's fundamentally wrong, so we must stop it now. Now, I'd like to point out it's equally fundamentally wrong as it is to export e-waste to simply end someone's employment in one day. If we're exporting something, and if they're relying upon that for their sustenance, for their job, and as we cited from the president of the Harvard environmental sector, they stated in 2004 that essentially these companies have 10,000 people working on this in New Delhi alone, and it's an over $1 billion economy. We're shutting down this economy in a day rather than providing some sort of a feasible phase-out alternative to not shut down and destroy the incomes of these impoverished individuals in simply a day. We see that for these reasons we would ask for a negative ballot, because the affirmative plan doesn't solve them, because there are disadvantages to the poor under their plan. For these reasons we would ask for an affirmative ballot. Thank you.